We've been talking about the mass shootings and what's going on in schools. Active shooter insurance. It might seem crazy, but it's not. Insurance expert, president and co-founder of GDP Advertiser, Seth Denson, on with me now. Seth, good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Now, look, your company began offering active shooter insurance a couple of years ago. Why is that? And tell me why general liability coverage is no longer enough.
Well, we did. We sit on a number of, we'll call them think tanks with underwriting partners and gather with these folks regularly to talk about what we call emerging risks that the insurance market really hasn't identified appropriately. And as you know, regardless of what type of insurance you might purchase, the last thing you want is a gray area, right? You definitely don't want those areas that you're not sure how the policy is going to react.
Now, Seth, are we talking? I'm sorry to jump in, but are we talking about business owners? Insurance for business owners? Okay, all right.
Specifically for business owners.
Okay.
Yeah. So, most business owners would purchase a general liability policy for their organization, and so we started looking at how that reacted to active shooter situations. And what we found was it really didn't address it at all. And specifically, after the Aurora movie theater shooting, what we found was the jury really didn't react in a way that the insurance company was found to be liable in any way. So, again, this was a gray area that needed to be addressed by the insurance market. And in one of these conversations that we were having with our underwriting partners, this topic came up, and we started putting pen to paper and thoughts down, and Lloyd's of London stepped up and said, yeah, this is sadly a risk that isn't addressed and unfortunately an area that we need to address.
Well, this kind of insurance is brought into the spotlight by a number of lawsuits brought by survivors and relatives of those killed in mass shootings against property owners and operators, and it was usually based on the defendant's alleged failure to employ adequate security and safety measures, which could trigger payment claims of the defendant's liability insurance policy. So once a couple of those started popping up, you guys had to have thought, okay, this is something we got to address.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll tell you that the way that we addressed it wasn't just, hey, we'll buy this policy and it'll cover the liability. It's very underwritten specifically in a way that says that if an organization wants the up to $20 million of protection that this policy provides, they have to undergo vulnerability testing and security training and what happens in an active shooter situation, how do we react, and it has to be an ongoing process. The whole idea of this was let's make organizations safer and protect them, and if you're willing to undergo this process, then the insurance company will step up if you do have one of these situations and protect you.
Talking right now to insurance expert, president, co-founder of GDP Advertiser, Seth Denson. His company began offering active shooter insurance a couple of years ago. Seth, how have companies, business owners reacted to this? Because so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, most juries have been reluctant to hold businesses liable for the failure to stop a determined shooter. So have people really taken to this, or are they still kind of like, yeah, Seth, I don't know, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to wait till juries start hammering business owners before I even think about it?
Yeah, we haven't seen it as an uptick in the phone ringing off the hook of people saying, yeah, we really need this. We've seen a lot of attention to it, especially as of late, in the last couple of months, specifically after the Parkland shooting. We've seen people really starting to look and see what this is all about. And what my hope is that organizations don't look at this from a standpoint of, hey, we want to financially protect ourselves, but, hey, we want to be better organizations, protect our people and those that come into our doors. And so, it hasn't been one of those things that is just, we'll call it jump off the shelves. Part of that's us. Listen, this is not a topic that I really enjoy talking about. I wish this was something that wasn't necessary to be in my portfolio. So the marketing of it probably hasn't been as good as it should be, and that's almost intentional. But at the same time, it's one of those risks that we need to address.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I mean, this is kind of walking the fence between responsibility and some people out there looking at this as a money grab by the insurance industry, almost like not a whole lot of couth involved. I mean, that's got to be well, like you just talked about, a balancing act for the insurance industry, not to come off as being insensitive.
Yeah, I'll tell you, even for me, when I came home the first day and told my wife about, hey, listen, I think this is something we're going to address and try to solve, it was, oh, don't be that guy, and we don't want to be that guy either, but this is the industry. Listen, I hate having to deliver checks when people die from life insurance, but this is a sad reality, and we want to make sure organizations are protected. And that's why we really structured it where the emphasis is on prevention. The emphasis is on protection. And, listen, I've got two young daughters myself. The last thing I want is for them to go to school that hasn't properly addressed these these liability and risk situations. And so I'm hopeful that as this policy becomes more prevalent in the marketplace, it becomes so in a way that makes organizations step up and say, we got to do a better job of protecting.
Hey, Seth, I got to ask you this because we've all been in this position. When you first approached this with your wife and said, hey, honey, I want to bounce something off you, did she give you that look after listening to you like, the hell's the matter with you? Or was she a little more professional in her response?
No, she gives me that look that many wives give on a first response, and you go, what? But I'll tell you, once we started talking about it, she goes, you know what, you're absolutely right. This isn't addressed. It needs to be. Well, the way that we structured it, she went, okay, I'm in on this.
Well, yeah, I mean, you think about it, and you know as well as anybody, I mean, we live in a it's everybody else's fault society, a blame-driven society. So if you're a business owner, you could take every precaution out there, but if somebody finds a little something where they think they can get a lawsuit through and hammer you, and I'll even throw this in fairness, when people are grieving and in shock, they just want somebody to blame, you could become a target.
That's exactly right. And what we try to do and address with this policy isn't just the overall financial aspect, but as I mentioned before, you get training, vulnerability testing, funeral expenses of those that are killed are covered, hazmat's covered, but grief counseling is also covered. So it's, hey, we want to help people get back on their feet as much as possible after one of these situations arises.
All right, Seth. Hey, I appreciate your time today, buddy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, that's insurance expert Seth Denson. As I mentioned, his company began offering active shooter insurance a couple of years ago. Good discussion.
All right, we're going to pivot now to Seth Denson. He's an insurance expert. And Seth, thanks for joining Forrest and me in Memphis today. How are you?
Hey, good morning, guys. I'm doing well. Things are beautiful here in Texas. Sun's starting to come up, and it'll be a nice day.
I hear the three words active shooter insurance. Seth, is that a real thing or going to be a real thing?
Man, I'll tell you, when this first came to our desk a few years ago, we kind of had that same probably thought in your mind and pit in your stomach when we went, is this a reality? Is this what the world has come to, that we have to do this? But sadly, yes. The insurance market, unfortunately, had not addressed this real risk in the world today. When it comes to insurance, regardless of what type of insurance, the last thing somebody that's bought a policy once is a gray area that isn't addressed, right? I mean, goodness, Farmers Insurance has done a whole suite of commercials about how they handle unique situations that come up. And so, one of the things that we do in our organization is we sit on a number of think tanks and kind of round tables with underwriting partners throughout the world, one of which is Lloyd's of London. And a few years ago, the topic of how does the insurance address active shooter situations came up. And then, shortly thereafter, we saw after the Aurora movie theater shooting that the insurance policy really didn't address it at all. And so one of the things that we are constantly looking at is how does the market need to react? And so on this advisory group that we sit on, we started taking up the topic of active shooter situations, and Lloyd's of London stepped up and said, you know what, this is something we need to address, and we need to make sure people are protected if they have this policy.
That's got to be a difficult conversation to have amongst the think tank because, because you're looking to set some sort of policy, that means you got to talk about the criteria.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When we first launched this thing, it was specific to schools. And I heard y'all's last segment talking about car seats. I get it. I got 2 young daughters, and when I start thinking about my kids, this is the last thing in the world I want to talk about and think about. But unfortunately, the industry that I chose is one that says, hey, listen, we don't put things together for people that are guaranteed things will happen. We put programs like this together for the event of something does. How do we protect them? But I'll tell you the biggest piece of this that I'm actually proud of is that in order for an organization to have this policy issued to it, it has to undergo extensive risk assessment and training on what to happen in an active shooter situation. So the whole methodology behind this platform wasn't necessarily to, hey, I hope we never pay out a claim. I hope this thing doesn't end up being needed and it goes away very quickly. But reality is it may not. And so what is the purpose? The purpose is prevention. The purpose is to make sure that an organization that has this policy undergoes a thorough and extensive review and ongoing training to make sure that it's protected as best as it can be.
Seth Denson joining us this morning on Memphis Morning News. Seth, what businesses are the most likely to look at getting something like this?
Well, just like anything else, right? I was talking earlier to someone, and they said, "Well, does every business need this?" And I said, "Well, every business that doesn't have a crystal ball ought to look at any risk that they could potentially face." But as we start to look at the variances of risk and which ones are higher in propensity to probability, I would tell you that schools and universities are probably the first place I would look to have a conversation about it with. Second would probably be houses of worship, right? Churches and things like that. Places where multiple persons come in with a very open door type of policy. Those are the organizations I think should probably look at something like this. And if they aren't looking at this from an insurance perspective, at least look at their organizations and identify where they're vulnerable and how to protect themselves. That would be where we would start.
All right, Seth, thank you so much for joining us on Memphis Morning News. Hope to talk to you again real soon. Maybe we can talk about some other general risks. It's good to talk to you, but I hate that we have to talk on this particular subject.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me on, guys. Hope you guys have a great day there in Memphis.
Thanks, Seth.
3 words I thought I would never say: active shooter insurance. That is proposed to be a thing now. We're talking with an insurance expert, president and co-founder of GDP Advisors, Seth Denson, our guest on 710 KURV. What is active shooter insurance? How does it work, and do we need it?
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me on today. You said this word you never thought you'd say. I've been in the insurance business almost 20 years, and sadly, it was something I never thought would be within the portfolio either, but it's a real reality of the world that we live in today. So, my background is actually in healthcare, but my business partner who runs our commercial practice, we sit on a number of think tanks, and one of those happens to be with Lloyd's of London. And, throughout the course of time, we will often sit down with those guys and talk through identifying risks that there is no real insurance response to, effectively gray areas in the risk marketplace. And a few years ago in one of these sessions, we were sitting around and discussing these risks, and unfortunately active shooter situations becoming much more prevalent than any other time in history. This became one of those areas that we said, how does the insurance market respond to this? And what we found out was it was a very gray area. And as most people recognize, when it comes to insurance of any kind, the last thing you want is a gray area of how a policy will or will not cover this. So that's how this came about. We launched it in underwriting and backing it back a couple of years ago.
Little background on me. I've been in banking for 8 years, and when we had real estate loans coming in, they're required to have insurance on it, and some of these policies that they had to have included terrorism and acts of God and that kind of thing. I don't know what it is on the healthcare side, but aren't these clauses kind of included in some of the plans? Does any of it work like that?
They are. Specifically to the types of policies that you're discussing there with real estate, those were specific surrounding a certain level of property damage before those portions of the policy were enacted. Terrorism policy has been around for years, but Orlando shooting is a great example. In the Orlando shooting, while there was a terrorism policy in place on the real estate, it didn't cover the aftermath of the active shooter situation from a hazmat and funeral expense and recovery and counseling and all of that. So when we looked at the marketplace, we identified all of the gaps and said, what are the big things? And I will tell you the most important thing was prevention. So think about it from a health insurance perspective, right? You typically get better insurance rates and a better experience if you're willing to go get your annual physical and do those types of things. Well, with an active shooter policy, if you want the insurance company to assume the liability, the financial risks associated with any aspect of an active shooter situation, you have to undergo a risk assessment. You have to undergo training on what to do, a vulnerability test. All of this is involved in this platform. And again, with the primary focus to be prevention and immediate reaction if one of these instances occur.
Active shooter insurance is now a thing, and we're discussing that thing with insurance expert and president and co-founder GDP Advisors Seth Denson on 710 KURV.
Seth, Tim Sullivan here. How much does it cost?
Tim, the premiums are really a basis of the overall risk portfolio. I'll tell you, when this was originally launched, it was isolated to only be offered to schools and universities. Private school with roughly 1,200 students, you're looking at $1 million of coverage being roughly $5,000 a year. So that's roughly the cost. For a traditional business, it's kind of the same aspect. How many employees, how many points of entry? These are the various variables. But in the grand scheme of other insurances, general liability, EPLI, workers' compensation, things like that, it's relatively small.
So who do you recommend purchase this? You mentioned schools, universities, businesses. Is that pretty much it?
Those are, sadly, if we look at the news, those are the most common areas you see this risk, right? It's like I'm not going to sell or encourage somebody in Arizona to buy flood insurance.
Yeah.
So this is the thing. This is just like any other insurance. You have to look at the overall risk portfolio of your organization, talk to those that you work with to help guide you through what are the real risks that I'm facing. I mean, obviously, given where we are in society, I would say that churches and schools are probably the two most common areas that we would see a higher propensity of risk. But any other organization can look at this based on their own employee portfolio and what they think their risks are. Listen, we are an insurance firm ourselves, and a few years ago, we started putting in safety and security protocols. Why? Well, if a claim gets denied from somebody, you never know what might tip somebody off and get them frustrated. So, unfortunately, this is the sad state of the world that we live in, and every company needs to look at the holistic view of overall risk in all aspects of their organizations and determine at that point what's the right way to protect ourselves.
Is there a personal policy being offered?
Right now, no. So this isn't something that you or I as individuals can go out and purchase on our own. It is the case oftentimes when new products come to the insurance market that are backed by a company like Lloyd's of London. They're going to isolate where this policy can be put into place so they can start to manage the analytics associated with it and find out how do we improve it. So right now, again, is when it first launched, it was just schools, then it extended to houses of worship, and now it's available to any and all businesses. But that's really where it ends right now.
Let me throw up a hypothetical for you, because and no, don't take any offense when I say this. Some insurance companies are known for walking around the topic and trying to get out of cashing out. Paying people out on their policy. So if I'm in a situation where, let's take the shooting in Florida for example. If I was on campus but not necessarily in the building at the time, and I want to go, say, experience, would the insurance be able to cover it?
So the specifics of the policy do cover, grief counseling and all of that for anybody that was directly impacted. Now, as you mentioned at the onset, at the end of the day, it's a claims adjuster that comes in and identifies those persons that were directly impacted, whether that be family members, persons on staff, on campus, so on and so forth. So there are some varying degrees of separation to the situation, right? If I watched on the news and became upset because of it, because I live in Texas and I have 2 young children and what would happen to me, obviously those are areas that would fall outside the boundaries of this. But those folks that are directly impacted, there is still that human element of claims adjusting. I would tell you, though, that in a situation like this, organizations like Lloyd's of London are very reputable in how they approach this. This isn't Sands of Time Insurance Company putting this thing out there. This is a company like Lloyd's of London, in fact.
Hey, we thank you much for your time. President and co-founder of GDP Advisors, Seth Denson, joining us on 710 KURV.
So this is a question that, honestly, I never really thought I would ask. Should businesses have active shooter insurance? New products show insurers are reassessing risk in mass shootings.
Joining us on the Kogo News Live line, insurance expert and president and co-founder of GDP Advisors, Seth Denson. Good morning, Seth.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So what exactly is active shooter insurance?
So active shooter insurance is really meant to serve as a definitive response mechanism financially to things that the current insurance markets don't specifically address in general liability policies. So, as you have an insurance or a business would have an insurance policy that specifically addresses liability, that doesn't necessarily specify exactly how it would treat an active shooter situation. And so what the insurance market has done is it has reacted to what we call an emerging risk. Years ago, we didn't talk about cyber risk, but now most businesses have cyber protection policies. Well, unfortunately, based on where our society is right now, an emerging risk is active shooter situations. And so what the insurance policy does is it effectively oversees and addresses the financial implications of what happens if an active shooter situation occurs, whether that be financial expenses associated with funerals, hazmat cleanup, grief counseling, but most importantly, it provides a full pre-assessment, a risk assessment, and training on what to do if an active situation occurs so that organizations can help mitigate as many casualties as possible.
When it comes down to it, I mean, you think of the shooter situation in Las Vegas, and there's a lot of questions about, how did he get all of those guns in the rooms? But ultimately, I mean, was it the hotel's fault that this guy took a bunch of guns into a room and attacked a crowd of people who was there to see a concert?
Right. So, the specifics of the policy, unlike most other insurance policies, aren't meant to structure or establish blame or fault. Rather, it's meant to be an overlapping protection to help regardless of fault. So the idea here is that, not far from where you guys are in San Bernardino, right, you had an office building where a gentleman went in and killed a number of people and injured many others. It wasn't that building's fault, but there still was financial exposure and expense as a result of it. And I think it is a matter of time, though, as these situations become more prevalent, where juries just might start to find businesses at fault if they haven't gone through proper preventative processes to ensure that if one of these things occurs, casualties are limited.
Yeah, normally, how do survivors pay for their hospital bills? What is the process that goes on there?
You can get really deep into the weeds into terminology like subjugation and transference of risk. But, hospital expenses typically are covered by those that would be covered under health insurance. But there may be specific details within certain policies that negate coverage. And that's why we tell all of our folks that we represent and advise, and I tell anybody that's listening, the devil's always in the details. The last thing you want in any policy in which you think you have financial protection is to make assumptions. You want them specifically addressed. And that's what this policy does for business owners. But I would tell anybody anywhere to make sure that they're assessing risk appropriately and ensuring that the policies that they're paying for will support them if and when they're needed.
All right, Seth Denson, thank you so much for your time. He's an insurance expert and president and co-founder of GDP Advisors.
Just scary that you have to think about things like mass shooter insurance.
Right now, we're going to be talking about insurance. And apparently, insurers are starting to reassess what they call risks and active shooter insurance. Lawsuits have been brought by survivors and relatives of those that have been killed in mass shootings, and they've been bringing these suits against premises owners and operators based on the defendant's alleged failure to adequately employ security and safety measures, which could trigger payment claims under the defendant's liability insurance policies. And to talk about that this morning, he is an insurance expert. He's the president and co-founder of GDP Advisors. Seth Denson joins us. His company actually began offering active shooter insurance a couple of years ago. So, Seth, out of curiosity, why is it that the general liability, the commercial general liability policies that most businesses have aren't or won't or don't cover something like this?
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
I think that the main thing to think about here that we addressed when we started to work with our underwriting partners on this type of policy was how would those types of policies respond, and what was maybe more of a gray area that needs to be addressed. When it comes to insurance specifically, any insured wants to know that the things that they're paying for insurance for will protect them if and when they're needed. And unfortunately, there are a number of emerging risks that are coming into the marketplace. A few years ago, cyber was one of these, right? How does hacking get treated in the marketplace? And so, as we sit in these think tanks about what emerging risks are coming up, active shooter became one of these topics. And unfortunately, as we started to dissect general liability policies, it wasn't clearly addressed, which leaves it up to question how a specific insurance company, and there's literally dozens out there, would address it. And it's up to a claims analyst. And the thing is, you don't want this to be a gray area. You want this to be a specifically addressed area. And that's why Lloyd's of London, who underwrites the first known active shooter insurance policy, created it to serve almost as a bolt-on to a traditional general liability policy to make sure that this is addressed.
I guess I don't understand why it wouldn't be under a general liability policy. I mean, I realize that the insurance companies are in the business to make money, and they don't make money paying off claims. But, why wouldn't – I mean, what is it about an active shooter situation that would make it different from other hazards that would occur in the normal course of business?
Well, I want to make sure to address the fact that this active shooter policy isn't to assume liability for anyone or to cause liability to be assumed for any organization. Rather, it's to prevent a situation like this from going into court to have to create a situation where there is blame applied. And what I mean by that is if a policyholder has this policy, there are 4 key components that are addressed within an active shooter policy. The first and foremost is the prevention. So the biggest part of an active shooter policy is a preventative risk assessment and training on what to do if an active shooter situation occurs, which really any organization should have some type of structure or process of what to do, whether they're ensuring that or not. But the second piece is it covers funeral expenses, hazmat cleanup, any financial impact, but it also covers grief counseling to make sure that those that are impacted are able to get the help that they need from a grief perspective. So the whole idea of this policy wasn't to say let's make sure that if somebody is found liable that they're protected. Rather, it's to say let's just take that off the table, and if they have this policy, that it's going to step in and take care of what's needed regardless of who is liable or not.
Okay. When you talk about risk assessments, I mean, there is no such thing as a riskless society. I mean, you think of most businesses, and I mean, it could happen at an office, as happened in California last year. It could happen at a movie theater. It could happen at a school. It could happen in any number of places. Short of having metal detectors at every egress, how do you go about preventing something like this? Or, having the doors locked all the time and just letting patrons in one person at a time?
I don't know that there's any way to be 100% protected or preventative in one of these situations. But as we've learned, as we've seen in other active shooter situations across the country when these things have occurred, those organizations that were properly trained, I mean, we've seen the videos now a number of times of what teachers need to do in an active situation to lock the door, to step away from the door, to go to a certain corner. Those types of things are trainings that can happen that necessarily doesn't prevent the active shooter situation from occurring. But what it does do is says once it has occurred, we're going to limit the potential casualties as much as possible because people know what to do, how to respond, where to go, and how to act.
So is the assumption here, since this could happen anywhere, as I said, I mean, it happens in businesses. I mean, my sister-in-law, 15 years ago, went through a situation at a factory she worked at. Is the suggestion now by the insurance industry that every business on the planet or in the United States needs to have this kind of insurance?
I don't know that every business needs to necessarily have this insurance. I would tell you that every business needs to address the potential risk, but then businesses have to make financial decisions as to where they're more apt to be impacted by these risks and not to oversimplify, but let's talk about flood insurance, right? Most organizations in Arizona probably don't buy flood insurance. But those organizations that may be more prone to this, for instance, schools and universities or churches or houses of worship or places like movie theaters, places where there are masses of people that come in and out and flow through without usual security protocols that allow them in and out of the doors, those are the types of organizations that are probably at a higher risk of this happening and should at least look at this as a potential add-on or go to their current general liability policy providers and say, how is this specifically addressed? Regardless of either one of those things, these organizations should absolutely take a step in the preventative structure of saying, what happens if this occurs? How do we react? What do our people do? How do we protect the masses as much as possible?
All right. Seth, we appreciate you joining us on the Wake Up Call this morning.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, take care. Seth Denson on the Wake Up Call this morning. It is News Radio 1120 KPNW.
Insurers are offering mass shooter insurance. On the Lippman Law Newsmaker line is a good friend of this program. He's an insurance expert, the president and co-founder of GDP Advisors, and his company did begin offering active shooter insurance a couple of years ago. It's Seth Denson. Seth, welcome back to WHO in Des Moines. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, Seth, obviously the question to open with is, who are you selling this to and why is this specifically needed?
You know, listen, it's about as fun as talking about this is probably what, you thought going into this topic as well.
I know you sound a little more down than when I've talked to you in the past. I understand that completely.
Can we get back to healthcare?
Yeah, we'll get back to healthcare in a couple of weeks.
But no, this is one of those things, though, is part of what we do in our organization is we sit on a number of think tank panels with the insurance markets. And within these panels, we oftentimes are addressing what we call emerging risks, things that the insurance markets haven't reacted to or maybe liability policies don't specifically address. Years ago, it was cyber, right, when hacking became a thing. And now the insurance markets responded. Well, this unfortunately has become such a state of reality that the insurance market has realized that the existing general liability policies have not specifically addressed what to do or how they will react in an active shooter situation. So these additional policies have had to be created, and Lloyd's of London, who is kind of the founder of all things insurance, is who has created this policy for business owners. Specifically, originally, it was meant for schools only, schools and universities, and then it expanded to houses of worship, and now it's available in all markets to all businesses.
Well, and this has to do with, say, I am in a place where a shooting takes place and I'm injured or, God forbid, killed, Seth. Then there's a question about how much that place, that store, that church, that theater was responsible for my injury. So that's, I guess my question is, this is not something that liability would cover?
No, not traditionally, or at least it's a very gray area. It's not specifically addressed. I mean, let's take the Aurora movie theater shooting, for example. The general liability policy specifically did not address this, and thus the jury did not rule in favor of the plaintiffs. They ruled in favor of the business owners. So, juries have thus far been hesitant to hold businesses liable.
Right.
But what I said earlier to someone else was, you don't want it to get to the point where it has to go to a trial to find out that if somebody's covered. And so the whole idea of this policy is not to place blame or fault or liability. It's rather to say there are financial implications as well as mental implications and grieving implications. And this policy addresses all of those things, up to $20 million to help with financial expenses, whether that be funeral expenses or cleanup or rebuild, any of those types of things. It also includes things like grief counseling, but in addition, it includes a preventative structure that says if you want to buy this policy, you have to undergo a risk assessment and make sure that your organization knows what to do and how to react in the case of an active shooter situation to reduce the potential casualties that could occur. So we're very glad to see that was the big catalyst of this policy was the prevention piece.
That is Seth Denson. Seth, it's a tough topic, but I really appreciate you talking to me about it again. Thank you very much.
Jeff, thanks for having me back on.
You bet.
New products show insurers reassessing risk in U.S. mass shootings. Insurance expert, president and co-founder of GDP Advisors, Seth Denson. Seth, how are you?
Hey, good morning. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
You guys deal in charts and stuff. How in the world do you figure out an active shooter insurance? Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, was kind of the thought process when it came across our desk for the first time as well. But, one of the things that we do in our organizations, we sit on a number of panels with insurance companies, and one of those panels is with Lloyd's of London. And in one of these conversations a few years ago, as these conversations normally go, it was around, hey, what are risks that employers are facing now, businesses are facing that aren't really addressed by the insurance market? And this is a constant conversation. Listen, years ago, cyber was the topic that we started on that day. But unfortunately, in this most recent conversation, it was active shooter.
So what do people, are people buying this?
Well, not yet. It's just kind of come to market as of now, and probably the thought that you had when you first heard that this thing exists was the same thought we had when we said, "Man, we have to create it."
Yeah.
This isn't something I was proud to get to come home and tell the missus that, "Hey, guess what we've done today." But sadly, insurance is one of those areas that rarely do we get to talk about the great things that we got to do. But it's a reality, and it's one of those that needed to be addressed. Most business owners think that they're properly insured, think that the general liability coverages that they have are going to address issues that come up. But the reality is that these policies are oftentimes written with what we call gray areas that aren't specifically addressed. And if I'm a business owner and something happens to me and my organization, the last thing I want is the insurance company to come in and make a determination based on something vague that wasn't specifically addressed.
Well, how do I know I'm not being upsold by a guy like you, Seth?
Sure. Well, one of the things is I had sold one of these things. I've had it for 2 years, and it's not one of those things that we intentionally talk about. As we talk with our clients, and specific to our organization, is one, we don't collect commissions on insurance products. So that's a pretty easy way that organizations know that I'm not upselling them.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a telltale. If you're not getting some big old bunny at the end of my signature, that for sure tells you. But yeah, if somebody were to buy an active shooter insurance policy, it can't be very much because your odds aren't very good, right?
It ranges in cost based on vulnerability, what the organization does. When this was first released, it was released in limited distribution, only to be sold in schools. And then it expanded into houses of worship, and now it's available across all business lines. But it is underwritten. And so the prices are based on an overall underwriting perspective. But if you've got a large university, let's say a university with 40,000 students.
Oh, that would be us here, University of Illinois, Seth. So we're right here.
Yeah, you can get this policy anywhere from $1 million in liability up to $20 million, ranging from anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000 a year.
Crazy. It is an icky thing to even think about, but it's sadly true that it is part of our lexicon now, and it's in our consciousness, which is horrible. I did buy earthquake insurance. We got that new Madrid, out there, but I think I'm paying like $100 a year or something. Not very much.
You mentioned it. Unfortunately, nobody has a crystal ball, right? And if the unexpected occurs, we want to make sure that we're protected. And I'll tell you the biggest part of this policy that I am proud about is if you want this policy as an organization, it's not just pick up the phone and buy it. It is you have to go through a vulnerability assessment.
Right.
Your people have to be trained on what to do in an active shooter situation, how to protect themselves and those around them. And if you want the protection, you got to be trained.
This isn't one of those buy online deals, then.
Not at all.
And save you a whole bunch of time and all of that.
Yeah. Save you 15 minutes of Geico, right? That's right.
That's it. Yeah, not what we're talking about here. That's for sure.
Well, and Seth, I wondered about like flood insurance. A lot of people in our area were experiencing that a few weeks ago, and there are some fine print areas of that as far as if it comes in through the roof, or if you live by a river, or if your basement floods. There's all kinds of clauses in that. I was finding out in my circle of friends on that.
That's so true. And again, kind of going back to my original statement of these gray areas and fine print, and as we started to look through the policies that organizations had around general liability, we started diving into fine print and finding that active shooter was not properly addressed, and it needed to be.
All right, Seth, good meeting you. How do people find your organization?
Yeah, they want to learn more about specifically this topic. ActiveShooterInsurance.com. ActiveShooterInsurance.com is the best place to go.
Nice meeting you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Seth Denson is his name, Denson.